And of course, we know that there have been lots of developments regarding the TPPA and regarding the direction that neoliberalism has taken under this new regime. So Teresa gave a great segue into what I'm about to discuss right now. So we're going to be talking, and can everyone hear me? Is that okay? So right now I'm going to talk about Gabriela USA. If you're not familiar, is a women's organization that is part of the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, and everything that we're talking about in terms of imperialism, it's just heightening, because we understand that there is amidst this global crisis, the contradictions are heightening for the ruling elite, and then what is happening is that it's even much more of a burden on working class people, on people whose backs have been broken for centuries in service of this system. So, but we don't let that system continue. We do whatever we can to ensure to dismantle it and to ensure that it ends, because it's between living or it's between letting these people, continuing to have these people exploit us. So I'm going to talk about particularly the Philippine situation. So imperialism has targeted the Philippines for a long time, and in particular US imperialism. So, okay, you can go ahead. So just real quick in broad strokes, the Philippines is 7,100 islands. It is in a very key area in terms of anyone who controls these channels, which is basically the gateway to Singapore, gateway to Malaysia, gateway to the rest of Asia. So these have long been important commercial routes and waterways since, if you think of the days of Marco Polo, since all of those explorers and conquerors and original imperialists. This is still the case today, obviously. So anyone who controls these waterways has control of those markets. So this is why the United States is constantly in this area, and particularly the southern area. On top of that, not only the waterways, the resources that are located in the Philippines themselves, in terms of having the largest deposits of gold globally, the largest deposits of nickel globally. So all of us, if you have a cell phone, whatever, all that nickel, a lot of it comes from the Philippines, and it's not being mined. It's being mined by multinational corporations based in Switzerland, based in Canada, and based in the United States. So as I mentioned, in addition to the minerals, of course, there is lots of agribusiness in the Philippines, right? So if you know of Dole, if you know of Del Monte, in terms of bananas and coconuts and pineapples, a lot of the land has been taken from peasants for agribusiness. So basically land that might have been used for rice, for subsistence farming, and for peasants to be able to feed themselves and feed their families, are now totally changed and made for just bananas. And now what happens is the people who lived off that land now are starving, right? And not only what happens to people in terms of displacement, what happens to them in terms of economic violence, it also results in environmental degradation. So I don't know if you can see these graphics, but this just tells you, in the Philippines, the 25 richest Filipinos, right? So these tiny faces here, but there's only 25 of them. Collectively, 25 people, we know this globally, but in the Philippines particularly, these 25 people together have $41.4 billion US dollars net worth, which is equivalent to nearly the total net worth of the poorest 75% Filipinos. So that's just 25 people, okay? Going to the next picture. So this is a picture of the 2015 National Budget Funds, a big business interest, right? So these are just 5 of these 25. So this is just a quarter of them. And if you think of 2015, the billions of pesos, which translated to about like $45 to a peso, for public-private partnerships. This person right here, Henry C., he got 1.6 billion pesos from the previous administration for school building projects. And if you remember, the worst typhoon in recorded history hit the Philippines in 2014. So this guy was the person who has been, he's the mall guru. He builds lots of malls in the Philippines, but he was tapped to build schools. And he was tapped to rebuild the education system in these areas that were ravaged by the typhoon. So But these are the same 5 people. If you see in the history of the Philippines, which is not unlike our history, in the United States, it's the same names that have cropped up over and over again, the same families from the same ruling elite. So this is the situation in terms of this is who is monopolizing all of those resources that I mentioned earlier. So these are pictures of what the 99% of Filipinos experience, and definitely part of the 75% of Filipinos are peasant farmers. So these are actually displaced peasant farmers, and I'll explain who displaced them. And these are actually people after Typhoon Yolanda. So particularly the condition of Filipino women. Landlessness as a result of land grabbing and liberalization of the agricultural industry, and then conversion of agricultural land, like I mentioned. Given that if you're talking about 75 million Filipinos, 75 million people who have nothing, and then half of all the classes in the Philippines are women, right? So half of those 75 million people are women, and in terms of how women have to bear this brunt, right? In terms of the education, the fact that in terms of displacement, the fact that the majority of migrant workers as a result of these neoliberal and imperialist policies, that the majority of migrant workers from the Philippines are women, 70%, because they are forced to migrate into service sectors such as being a nanny, such as working in hotels or in restaurants or what have you. A lot of these women originate in this peasant class, and it's those people that have some means to be able to whether move to an urban area or move to another province, and those who are able to have enough money move abroad, and of course of the exploitation that they face. So joblessness, like I mentioned, but there's also extremely low wages, discrimination, and increased contractualization. In the Philippines, even the mall person that I mentioned, Henry C., who all of his workers, basically, he has increased the contract. He has decreased the length of time of their contract for his workers in his malls that result in billions and billions of dollars of profit. And his family is not only one of the richest in the Philippines. His family was on the cover of Time magazine as the richest family in Asia. And but he has only the longest term that any of those workers have is 3 months. So when you think about what that means for sexual harassment, when you think that what that means of wage theft or any sort of contract violation, there are no labor rights, there are no rights at all that are built into a 3-month contract. Next slide, please. So this results in forced migration, right? Because if you're a Filipino and you're living in those conditions, you're thinking, I have no choice. If my family is starving, if I am starving, the only way I could do this, is to go abroad. So there was a labor export program that started under Marcos in 1974, and it is still going strong. 6,000 Filipino migrant workers leave the country every day, and like I said before, the majority are women. And the number one export of the Philippines is not pineapples, it's not all the gold that we have, it's not the silver, it's not the nickel, because we can't even count that because it doesn't go to our economy. It does not go to the Philippine GDP. It goes to the GDP of all those, of the bases of those multinational corporations. It's people. And it's from the remittances that are trying to keep this economy afloat. So we're going to go talking about free trade agreements for a little bit, about the history, given that the free trade agreements is how we got into the situation, because it was this harbinger, this bastion rather, of neoliberal and imperialist policy. But we'll talk about, even though Trump is like, yeah, I hate the Tppa, let's keep jobs in America. But, we'll talk about what that presidential, because it wasn't an executive order that scrapped the Tppa actually. Well, it didn't scrap. Actually, it was in place of, he said, I would prefer bilateral agreements, right? So that doesn't mean that these kinds of agreements are to the wayside. He wants to do it personally. He doesn't want to involve many countries. He wants to say, I'm making this deal in the Philippines, or I'm making this deal in New Zealand. So that's what's in place of the Tppa. So as we know, these FTAs worsen the socioeconomic crisis. For everything it's about for whom or for what, and this was never for the Filipino people. It's never for these countries where these free trade agreements are set up. Also, in terms of the environment, you know, lot of the degradation of the environment has been the result of like large-scale mining. The displacement that we saw earlier in those pictures were the result of mining corporations that had contracted with the paramilitary and the military to clear the land. So when they clear the land, it's not only large-scale mining, it includes clearing the land of people. So of course, in the face of imperialism, the way people are treated is it's just like another tree that needs to be mowed down. So, and that's something that has happened increasingly, actually, in the Philippines. One of the previous 2 presidents ago looked at Southern Philippines as the second war on terror, second front on the war on terror. And you know, but it's interesting that the area that was targeted for the second front on the war on terror was also this area that is so resource rich, like one of the most resource rich areas globally. Next one. So then there's lots of land grabbing, etc., forced evacuation, like I mentioned. Next one. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the fascist in chief. It's very hard for me to say his name. So we're gonna keep clicking, Sue, thanks. Next one. Next slide. Okay. So of course, you know, we're gonna go through his promises, right? So he promised to bring back jobs through economic protectionism, right? Like, what does that even mean? As Teresa mentioned earlier, I'm thankful you did because I didn't really focus on immigrants, I focused more on the economic policies. Deportation of millions of undocumented immigrants. Shutting all doors to refugees. And he is all of these things, right? Which, I mean, I am a lot of these things, right? A lot of us are all of these things. So I think, you know, everything that he's against is like what the people stand for, right? Who the people are. And as we know, he is fundamentally no different from Obama, right? And I understand in like other spaces, you know, folks are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And but the principal questions are for whom or for what, not how, right? Not how, because let's not forget that Barack Obama had the highest number of deportations in the history of this nation. 3 million people, right? Through low-level traffic infractions, right? From people who had a broken taillight or what have you, and then all of a sudden we're in deportation proceedings. So, you know, they still represent the monopoly capitalist interests, as we know, right? So they're from the same people who serve Oprah, who serve everybody else in this area, and not the people that, not the 99%. So that's something to understand, and this is something that is like up to us to educate everybody else that, you know, to kind of sweep them and make them understand that this is, we're continuing to serve these interests, and that this was always happening, but now it's happening in a way that is, everyone now feels it, right? So, but it's been going a long time. Because of the crisis of overproduction. It's something that these bureaucrat capitalists have been constantly thinking, scheming of different ways, right? So the scheme of Obama was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, right? He put things in place to help secure and solidify the U.S. Domination in the Asia Pacific. It was a new front. So as a result, there have been worsening social conditions, right? Worsening, and the response to that was to help boost the U.S. economy by going into these unequal and imperialist free trade agreements. The neoliberal policies brought severe misery on everyone, right? We're feeling it here, you know, we're feeling it, you know, and of course in the Philippines and other countries. And, you know, like originally Trump said he was opposed to free trade policies, right? And wanted to institute higher tariffs on China. And there's been this global manufacturing slowdown because of this crisis, and also widespread joblessness. So wages are being cut, and workers have less income, as we know. So, next slide. So this is a little small, but, you know, so first this is about Trump's memorandum on scrapping the TPPA. And like I said before, it was not necessarily a scrap because there is a hierarchy of the types of orders that the executive can sign. So there's the executive order, there's the presidential memorandum, and then there's a proclamation, which really doesn't mean anything and largely symbolic. But so this wasn't an executive order, right? And this is just something like, I don't want to do the TPP because I favor bilateral agreements, like I mentioned, right? But this doesn't mean he didn't issue an EO to say the TPPA is over. But think of the things that he did issue an EO for. He issued an EO on immigration ban. He issued an EO for building the wall. So he's very, even though he's taken these hard stances, as we've known, because this is what the ruling elite does, they waver and waffle and listen to people like Steve Bannon or what have you. So to still solidify the economic interest, it was just a presidential memorandum, which isn't law or legal or anything. It's just like an internal directive. And then the intention was to do bilateral agreements instead. But he did issue an executive order on enabling American companies to be competitive with foreign firms in domestic and foreign markets. So, he says he's against free trade agreements, but this sounds like a free trade agreement to me, right? It is definitely an imperialist and neoliberal agenda. And then he's talking about permitting and reducing regulatory burdens for domestic manufacturing. But that doesn't mean that has no overseas or imperialist component. The other side, right, that was also mentioned by Teresa earlier, is the other side of these economic policies is the fact that, people don't take these policies lying down. People fight back. There have been Filipinos who have been fighting back. People in every country have been subject to these unequal treaties, have continuously fought back for centuries. And so the other side to it is the military aspect, the militarization, which I'll talk more about. And so not surprisingly, what Trump has done is that he has issued presidential memoranda, etc. His budget just came out that increased the budget of the Department of Defense and Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs. Well, everything in social services was like slashed. And so one of the memoranda that he did release was about rebuilding the U.S. armed forces. And last time I checked, they were pretty well built up. So the twin face of Plunder, right? This shows like the U.S. is like the world's policeman, right? And then it's up to us, public opinion, who are the boot, right? And like, is the U.S. stretched too thin? And of course, NATO, as we know, is the militaristic arm of G8 countries. And these are the people who are supposed to be keeping the peace, American peace. And like I mentioned before, in terms of the budget, these are the three agencies that got an increase, right? So, and a 10% increase in defense of a department that already has several $billion is significant. Okay, just more history. So why the U.S. occupied the Philippines, because of raw materials. It was also a dumping site for surplus goods, and like I mentioned, the strategic location. And then there has been a history of U.S. militarism since, starting in 1898 with the Philippine-American War, and then they established naval bases. So, and the way militarization works out, actually the more dangerous of outright physical warfare is actually the psychological warfare. So it's through winning the hearts and minds, right? So even today, even organizing women in certain areas like Bataan, which is the site of the Bataan Death March, during World War II, at the time of Japanese occupation. And what happened was, even organizing there, if you try to prop how these unequal military agreements with the United States are constantly they're negative, the negative impact on the Philippine economy, etc. They won't hear it because they're the generations of that legacy from the Bataan Death March. So even the women, if you tell them about the rape cases or what have you, the murders that have happened at the hands of U.S. soldiers, they're like, well, that's when the U.S. came, I knew that they got rid of the Japanese. So, it saved my family, it saved my, grandparents. So that's what I believe. So, so that Psy war is like ongoing, right? So before the Visiting Forces Agreement, there was military bases, but then they closed in 1992, right? Great victory. But post-military bases agreement, just because we don't have military bases doesn't mean that we don't have military. And after the bases, actually, the number of military has increased. So under the Visiting Forces Agreement, it's not really a visit, it's a misnomer because they've never left. The visit is the understanding that it's temporary, you're not staying, but even though there are no bases, they're just like everywhere. And the activities is unknown, the number is unknown, and the areas where they are is also unknown. So this is just a map of all the military operations between 2001 and 2013. So this is after 9/11. And so this southern area was the second front on the war on terror, supposedly. But then as we go to the next slide, Sue, sorry. Thanks. So these two maps, right? This map right here on your left is the mineral map. And this is a map of where the concentration of all the minerals in the Philippines. And the map on the right is the concentration of all the indigenous people in the Philippines. So when you look at some of the most marginalized populations, such as indigenous people, they're the ones who are disproportionately displaced because of where their ancestral land is located. And then as you see, if you remember, given that it's still the war on terror, but it's so strange that the deployment of the armed forces in the Philippines happens to match where all the minerals are. So the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, this was Barack Obama's the precursor to the TPPA. Before doing the economic agreement and getting everyone on board, he's like, let me make sure that the military is in the Philippines first. Like Noynoy Aquino, the previous president, didn't sign the TPPA yet, but he signed this, and it was basically like the VFA, but on steroids. Like they're allowed to do all the things in the VFA, but for 10 years, and then renewed automatically indefinitely. So there are reasons why you should oppose the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, because all those 5 reasons means it's terrible. The impacts on the Filipino people, as we know, what happens in terms of militarization. Human rights violations through counterinsurgency programs, extrajudicial killings, which I'll talk a little bit about, aggressive armed conflict in civilian areas, right? What happens a lot in the Philippines is red tagging, and they'll say, that person is a member of the New People's Army, and it's like, but there are guerrilla zones that are designated guerrilla zones, which are not by schools, which are not in civilian areas, so you're lying. And also undermining Philippine national sovereignty, right? It's only the U.S. that's been able to go to Guatemala and able to go to El Salvador and go to the Philippines and have more of their troops, or as many of their troops, stationed in those countries. When are you gonna? I've never seen a lot of Filipino troops here, right? Or Guatemalan troops here, or Salvadorian troops here. So this is the face of U.S. imperialism, right? The militarization is just as important as that key in order to keep that economic stranglehold on these countries. As we know, the particular impacts on women and LGBTQ communities. In terms of militarization, it's women that are subjected to rape. It is people who are LGBTQ that have been resulted in rape and harassment. I'll also talk about other cases in which one woman was murdered. And this is just all aspects. This militarization is just the heightened aspect of how the face of the state, right? How terrible the state is in the view of women, and how it views marginalized communities. So quickly, just the cases of Nicole and Jennifer Laude. Nicole was a woman that was raped by a Marine in the Philippines, and the U.S. said, okay, we see you have a valid case, so you'll drop your case. If you drop your case, we'll give you a green card in the United States. And because of the situation in the Philippines, her family agreed to the green card. But when you think of that is that's the U.S. offer. They're saying U.S. citizenship is worth more than your dignity as a Filipina. Right? And then talking about Jennifer Laude is a trans woman who was also killed by a U.S. Marine. And his excuse was, I didn't know she was a man. So I just panicked. And what he did is he choked her and and she was found in her head in a toilet, etc., strangled to death. But this whole time, when he's been when he was been held, by the U.S. Embassy came and swept him up and protected him, and he hasn't been served any sort of real charge at all or any sort of real term at all. That kind of crime should have been at the hands of the Philippine court, but not with U.S. imperialism. You think they're going to prosecute him even though he's a murderer? So when you think about the face of the state in the face of U.S. imperialism, and that it's true when we say, lives matter, right? Because clearly this is how the state looks at people's lives. This is the strata that we're in. And and it's up to us to ensure that that is not the case. We are telling the state that I matter more than you because I actually care about people other than the ruling elite. So the earlier pictures that I showed about the people who were displaced, there were killings that happened in this community that May and I actually visited. These are two people that were killed in the community. This is executive director of an indigenous high school, and he is an indigenous leader. And so when I mentioned how mining corporations clear the land just like trees. So the way to clear this area, there was a mining corporation called, I can't remember them. Anyway, it's an Anda Valley complex. It's an area that is rich in nickel, and this area has constantly resisted. And what happened was, in order to clear they knew the fastest way to clear the people, to strike fear in them, was they killed their leaders, in front of the community. And then they also, killed leaders, they rounded everyone up and killed everybody, at 4 a.m., the day after a major event at the school. So, of course, it resulted in a mass evacuation of 500 people. So the schools have been under attack, and not just in that community, but many other communities, because, what's the center of someone's livelihood? If children do not feel safe to go to school, if people do not feel safe sending their children to school, then what do? So they're forced to find other places. And then it clears it for mining corporations. Yeah. So that's more Save Our Schools and indigenous people fighting. I think I talked a lot about implications of U.S. empire. So this is just the increase in aid. Okay, so we fight, right? This isn't a way to live. This isn't a way for anyone to live, regardless if we knew those people in those pictures, whether we, it's like that is something, just knowing that story, knowing that's happening, knowing that anyone here who's paying taxes, that you're funding that. You're funding the military that went into those operations, that guided those operations, that oversaw them. So it's up to us as people say, oh my God, Trump is so terrible, and oh my God, versus Obama and Trump and et cetera, and Hillary or what have you. They were all serving the same interest anyway. And as we know, history shows us that it is the parliament of the streets, not the parliament of the state, that determines change. So what can we do, right? So like I said, people, not everyone out there knows that Barack Obama is just the other face, the other side of Trump, right? And it's up to us to talk to our communities. The time is so ripe. I think our organization should be growing. People out there are seeking, so it's up to us to do our outreach. So we need to expose and oppose these situations, right? The fact that so many people are feeling what I'm talking about in the Philippines is that we have to make those connections, right? And build that solidarity. Encourage people to join an organization, because this is not going to happen if you stand alone as an individual and kind of be like, okay, I'm going to sit and watch TV today, and then tomorrow I'm going to join something, and then I'm going to go back to watching TV. It's important for people to really stay engaged in mass movement. Also, protest, and protest in, it's important to be in the streets, right? Someone once said, no movement is a social media movement. If you're a Facebook person, if you're a Twitter person, and that's all that you're doing, I don't know what's going on there, I don't think Trump is on his Twitter, but I don't think he's on your Twitter. And then it's important to continue, hold these governments accountable as well. And then also expose yourself, right? If you're, there are many conferences that are being organized in this time period because people are agitated and angry as hell. So there is upcoming conferences to observe the actual situation in the Philippines that I just mentioned. We always have international solidarity missions happening and exposure trips. And finally, there's an upcoming International League of People Struggle and International Women's Alliance, which of course Monica's a part of, that we're sponsoring an anti-war conference in Canada in Toronto this August, and then there will also be a Band of Bases conference in the Philippines in this November. So these are just pictures from protests, because we're still doing it. And it's up to us to build the broad united front against this, right? Like I said, we have friends that are now activated. We know people that are not family members or whoever are now activated, and it's up to us to maximize that they're now activated. And it's up to us to call for unity and action and make those connections and bridge those divides that have kept some of our organizations separated. So it's important for us to sweep them in this moment. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna try and hit on the notes I wrote for myself for borders, super profits, like Sarah mentioned, and that also to touch on that deported Mexicans will get better jobs because they speak English. I think first I'm just going to address the borders issue, the fact that borders have been virtually erased because in service of imperialism and as a result of globalization. So the fact that you have corporations like Nike, corporations like Walmart, corporations like Old Navy, that, there are all their factories here in the United States, so it's to go circumvent any sort of occupational safety and health laws, any sort of labor laws. So they create these export processing zones, right? So that's just one example of there's no such thing as a border, right? The fact that even that the southern border of the United States touches the Rio Grande is a result of imperialism and manifest destiny and everything that was talking about those purchases, right? Those purchases, who are they purchased from? Who was the seller? And you talk about, those are Mexicans that are living in that area, right? And so I think that's something to understand, that what the erasure of borders is not from the people pushing borders. It's from imperialists who are not respecting borders and are not respecting imperialists because capitalism has grown to this stage where they have to go outside of the home country. So I gave that example in terms of the Philippines. So, and it's because, like Sarah mentioned, these wealthy, the concentration of people that you can count on your hands, right? From 25 people in the Philippines to 10 people globally, right? When you're talking about the Waltons, when you're talking about people like Bill Gates, and the fact that they have the wealth that is similar to continents and large percentages of global population. It's in order to retain those super profits is how the borders continue to get erased, why imperialism continues to heighten, and why the exploitation also continues to heighten. And the reason why the Philippines has always been targeted and has also been the example of U.S. imperialism, it's the reason why they're even, in 1908, actually, the United States established the first nursing school in the Philippines. So if you wonder why there are Filipinos in every single hospital, and even if you're looking at places like in the Midwest or what have you, it started that way, right? And in terms of prior to being politicized, I would see Filipinos everywhere, like in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in Spain, or what have you. And it's because of that U.S. imperialism that, that comrade said, Daisy, who mentioned that we are taught in an U.S. education system. Our constitution in the Philippines is the same, that was adopted in 1987, is the same constitution of this country. And it was adopted by Marcos. And so everything is all U.S. And you're going to the Philippines, as Teresa and Monica have seen, the directions are in English. Everything's in English because it's a U.S. neo-colony, right? Not even neo, long-time colony, right? So, so because of that, it's the fact that the forced migration, it's how all of a sudden you find Filipinos in the service sector because they're lends well to tourism, lends well to, in terms of being able to speak English to anyone or being able to speak Spanish in Spain. So I think those are things to understand, right? Because all of those people have families in the Philippines, right? They don't have families in the United States, and they don't have families in Spain or in Costa Rica or Colombia or in Africa for the men who are building pipelines, and also in Russia and Turkey or what have you. So it's this forced migration of the 10% of the Filipino population is all as a result of these imperialist economic policies. So, and this is why that was the function of being able to speak English, right? Like you're teaching English in service of U.S. imperialism, right? So this is why you want a Filipino domestic worker in your home, because you'll be able to raise your children and talk English to them, and you wouldn't have to worry about any sort of picking up anything while you are at work or what have you, right? And also understanding that, what's more welcoming than someone who can speak English to a tourist who arrives at a resort or wants an omelet at wherever, what have you, and it's a Filipino person that is taking your order and a Filipino person that is serving you that omelet. So we have to understand, like, all of that is not in service to those Filipinos who take those jobs, and not in service of those families that are separated as a result of those policies. So this is why it's important for us to continue to organize, right, and to educate people that those are not opportunities, actually. That's not, it's actually a violation of your right to be able to stay home with your family, that you can have a livelihood where you are from. You shouldn't be forced to be separated for an unknown amount of time, and many times die at being abroad, at base level being exploited by your employer or what have you. So those are not opportunities at all. And this is why we call it forced migration, because no immigrant decides to do that. No immigrant looks at their child and says, I want to leave you for an unknown amount of time just so I can feed you. That is a result of an imperialist system. And that's something that it's important for us to make sure that that message is clear. Because in the face of like a white supremacist, fascist government, you don't have to be a person of color to feel that. And you don't have to be a forced migrant to feel that. So it's important for us to make those connections, because the only way the situation is going to get better is if we're able to organize and fight together. Thanks.